you. And because God has purpose and future waiting on you, he has granted you some spiritual bodyguards. You've got to understand that you are under spiritual protection. And it really does not matter what happens. It doesn't matter where you go. It doesn't matter what comes your way. You've got to understand that God has assigned spiritual bodyguards to you. Listen here, make sure you understand that you are never alone, but that God is always with you. Make sure you understand that whatever you encounter and whatever you go through, the enemy cannot destroy you. Now I hate to bust your bubble, but can I tell you, listen here, it really ain't about your protection. See, your spiritual bodyguard is not here so much to protect you and me as much as it is to protect God's word in you. Our protection is really secondary, and the reason we have protection in the first place is because we're carrying precious cargo. The cargo you're carrying is the promise of God over your life. And when God makes a promise, he then assigns an angel to watch over his promise to see to it that it comes to pass. And since the promise is made to us, he now watches over us because the promise is on us. Somebody ought to get this morning, because anytime you've got promise over your life, God says, listen here, I'm watching over my word, and because I'm watching over my word that's in you, he says, I've got to watch over you. I wish I had somebody to help me preach in here today to understand that nothing can destroy you as long as there's a promise in your life. Now watch this, because some of us will say, well, I don't know whether or not I've got a promise over my life. In fact, I've never had an encounter with God where I've heard God promise. But listen here, the promise ain't always about what God said to you. Yeah. Sometimes the promise is about what God said to somebody who prayed for you. Yeah. Because listen, in the text, God is saying to Jacob, he's saying to Jacob, listen here. He says, listen here, I am going to bless your seed. And when you and I didn't have sense enough to pray, when we didn't have sense enough to get in tune with God, we are living the life we're living under the protection of God today because some saints some years ago talked to God about their seed. And some of us up in here blessed right now because of what God promised our mamas and our daddies. Some of us are blessed like we're blessed right now because we had some grandmamas and granddaddies and some great grandmothers and great granddaddies who did not enjoy the kind of liberty that we and I are enjoying today, but they knew how to get a prayer through. They knew how to talk to God, and they not only talked to God about themselves and their situation, but they talked to God about their seed that was to come. Can I preach in here and tell you, when you pray, your prayers cannot be, or ought not be, just restricted to this particular generation, but you ought to pray for generations that's to come, to cover them even before they are thought about, even before they are born. Some of us right now have divine protection because God promised somebody else that he would take care of us, and he's got to keep you, and God's got to keep you because he's got to keep his word. Can I say that again? God's going to keep you because he's got to keep his word. You've got protection. You've got protection. You've got protection. Look at somebody next to you. Tell them, I've got protection. Yeah, I got protection that I did not know I had because I've got promise hanging over my head. Now, the relevant question is, what do you do when the Lord has promised to be with you because he has a future for you? And here's what the text says about Jacob. I like this because God appears to Jacob. God speaks to Jacob while he's in the dream. God grants him traveling mercies. I mean, Jacob has got it. It's a blank check that God has already written over him. But Jacob helps us because when he recognizes the presence of God that's covering him, he understands how to properly respond to what God has said about him. And the text says, when Jacob was awakened from his sleep, the first thing he did was he got up and he went to worship. Can I say that again? When Jacob recognized the divine protection that was over him when he was awakened from his sleep, the first thing Jacob did was he got up and went to worship. The Bible said that he took the stone that he had laid upon that night and had used it as a pillow for his head. He now uses it for a pillow to make an altar, pours oil upon it, and he goes into worship. He calls the place Bethel. He declares that it is the house of God. He worships in the house of God. And listen, when you and I come to understand the future that God has for our lives, when we come to understand that God has plans for us, that God has a purpose for us, then there is one appropriate response, and that is you ought to go to worship. I mean, anytime you come to grips with the fact that God will sustain you and that God will keep you because God has a promise that is over you and that nothing can destroy you, then the first thing you ought to begin to do is to worship him. I told you that he prayed before he started his journey, but not only did he pray before he started his journey, he also worshiped before he started his journey. And that means that anytime you're getting ready to embark upon any journey in your life, you ought to begin that journey with worship. You ought to go on your knees and pray, but don't stop at just praying. You ought to stretch out before God and begin to worship God, because anytime you worship God, you begin to send the message, God, I want to stay in your presence. You do understand that that's what worship really is. Worship is coming into the presence of God. And what I like about it is that the presence of God is not restricted to a building. The presence of God is not restricted to some particular location. The presence of God is not restricted to some place with a steeple on top of the building. Oh, but anytime you can begin to transcend your present circumstance and begin to go into the spirit and worship God, you then begin to enter into the presence of God. And how many of you know that you need the presence of God with you everywhere you go? That means